Welcome back, fellow Illumineers, to Be Our Guest, the channel where we discuss all things Disney Lorcana. On today's episode, we're going to mix things up a bit and introduce what I hope will be one of many deck tech videos. Obviously, we're working with a limited card pool at the moment, so look for more of these videos leading up to the release of the first chapter, and ongoing as we explore new developments in the metagame. So, what is a deck tech video? Simply put, I want to share my thoughts around the decisions that I make, looking for individual cards, what I'm trying to accomplish with a deck as a whole, what cards make the cut, and what don't, depending on how they contribute to that goal. I'll break down decisions around ink costs, inkable versus non-inkable cards, and the ratio of character cards versus actions and items. Please remember that documenting this whole thing on YouTube is brand new to us. And I'd really appreciate if you'd leave in the comments below anything else that you'd like to see us explore. Anything that you agree or disagree on. If there's any other aspects of how we put a deck together that you'd find interesting. Decks that you'd like to see us put together. Any and all thoughts that you've got, please leave them in the comments down below. And thank you so much for watching and for sharing those with us. Let's get into it. I am going to be doing this on the fly, so please anticipate that there will be cuts, as this is not scripted, and I'm just trying to share some of my thoughts with you. So come on, let's have a discussion, let's have a conversation around how we put decks together, and hopefully you find it interesting, and hopefully it helps you when you go to build your own decks. So, if you'd like to come along this deck building journey, if you're brave enough for a peek into how my brain works, or if you'd just like a few more ideas on how to build your own deck, please be our guest. Now, before we begin, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Lorcana.com. I'm sure if any of you have been exploring the world of Lorcana, you've probably come across Lorcana.com. But Artem, who created the site, just put a heck of a lot of work into it and has been a real asset to any of us that are trying to create content, but really just trying to learn and play the game. So many cool features that you can explore on the website. What we're exploring today is obviously their deck building options, but also their card imagery. You might have noticed on some of the proxies that we're using, you'll see recreated by Lorcana. They've been putting a heck of a lot of work into the imagery, into the deck tech features. You can now share the deck as images, which we're going to try and do going forward with our gameplay videos. But please, I encourage you to check it out. They've got some content in there. There's even a possibility you might see us featured from time to time on Lorcana. That would be really cool. But regardless, some great creators out there that are putting together a lot of really useful content. So far, I'm already loving this community. Not a real surprise. Anything that's Disney related is going to bring together good people, right? But the community that's coming together, that's featured on Lorcana.com is wonderful. So I highly encourage you to explore that. But let's begin. So I sat down, I wanted to put a deck together. Where do you even begin? What way can we narrow things down for a little bit for ourselves? Well, first of all, you want to decide what kind of deck do I want to make? Okay? There are so many ways that you can play this game, which is obviously the wonderful thing about it, and one of the things that I love about it. If you haven't played trading card games before, you may not know even where to begin. If you have, bear with us, we're going to talk about some of the different types of decks that can be made. I'll put a timestamp throughout this for you to jump to different parts if this doesn't interest you. But let's talk about the different types of decks that you can make. Well, one of my favorites, and the one that we're going to be talking about today, is around card advantage. Usually those decks are labeled mid-range because they try and control the deck a little bit. They try and get a little bit of speed, a little bit of size. They kind of try to do everything well, but they don't necessarily lean into one aspect of the game too heavily, right? So when I say mid-range, think I do a little bit of everything. Jack of all trades, if you will. But one of the central fixtures of mid-range decks is card advantage. What do I mean by card advantage? Well, quite simply, most games are managing your resources. I start the deck, we both start the game with 7 cards in hand. And going forward, we draw 1 card a turn. So we're both on that same pace. If I can increase that pace or decrease your resources more than mine, I gain card advantage. One of the simplest way to do that is to draw extra cards. If I play 1 card that draws me 2 or more, I have more cards than I started with. I have card advantage. There's other ways to gain card advantage. For example, in the challenge system of the game, I have 1 character that challenges yours. If I have, for example, a 4/4 Robin Hood versus your 3/3 Mickey Mouse, and I challenge you, my character will stay on the board with 3 damage, and your character will be banished. Now, let's say the following turn, you're not able to do anything to Robin Hood, but you have a 2/2 character that is exerted, and I challenge again with Robin Hood. Now they both become banished, but at that point I have banished 2 of your characters for 1 of mine. I have card advantage. Why is this important? Well, in a game where both sides of the board don't necessarily eclipse the other overly much, if we keep wearing each other down in a game of attrition of sorts, eventually one of us at least starts running out of resources. If I have progressively gained card advantage over the course of the game and you run out of resources and I still have 1 or 2 characters on the board or extra cards in hand, at that point it is much more likely that I am going to win. But card advantage in and of itself is not the be-all and end-all. For example, we have other types of decks. Decks like tempo decks. What's a tempo deck? A tempo deck is usually trying to be faster than the other deck at getting to victory. I'm racing you to those 20 lore. So if I put out 4 characters before you put out your second character, there's a good chance that I might be able to exert enough to quest enough for lore before you can catch up. So for example, I quest with 4 characters and gain 5 or 6 lore. You might be able to banish one of those characters by challenging the next turn, but I still have 3 others waiting and I'm going to keep playing more. So my characters might be weaker than yours, but they cost less, and so through speed, I can potentially win before you can eliminate my resources, eliminate enough of my characters. So I may be getting card advantage, but if you go too fast and I am not able to control your board enough, then you could win before that card advantage becomes relevant. Another way to lose in spite of card advantage is if you can't get enough out on the board. I draw a bunch of cards, but not enough of them are meaningfully impacting the playing field, impacting the board, right? So if you put out 3 6/6 characters and I've got 4 2/2s, right? Even if I've got a bunch of cards in hand, if they're items or action cards that aren't relevant or whatever the case may be, or I do nothing but draw more cards, use all my ink drawing more cards, you will win in spite of my card advantage. So you need to partner card advantage with something, which is why Midrange tries to do a little bit of everything. They got some small creatures to manage the early game and protect against tempo. They've got some character removal to take care of the big characters. They've got some big characters of their own to try and match up. So that's the heart of the mid-range deck. There are also ramp decks. So big characters cost a lot of ink. So ramp is referring to ramping up your mana quicker, that was a Magic the Gathering slip, your ink, quicker than the opponent. Sapphire does this really well. Sapphire has cards like Mickey Mouse Detective that allow you to add extra ink to your inkwell beyond the one that you're allowed to put down each turn. So if I get to 8 ink when you still only have 5, you're inevitably going to be playing smaller characters than I am. So I can potentially get ahead by putting out bigger characters early, or just bigger plays in general. Who knows what cards may be revealed leading up to the first chapter being released, right? So ramp decks can be really interesting by putting out big characters and other big plays early, but they balance that with the fact that a lot of their board presence early is just going to my ink. So I got not a lot of characters out, but I got a lot of ink. Well, I got to be able to do something with that. So if they don't draw into their big characters, they can easily lose. So those are some of the 3 decks that we're going to explore over the early days of our gameplay and deck tech videos. But we'll explore other variations and other game plans and strategies as we go through leading up to and after the release of the first chapter. So, what are we going to start with today? Well, I can tell you, if anyone's familiar with Magic the Gathering, as a former blue Magic the Gathering player, I love Card Advantage. It is absolutely the first place that I wanted to look. And as soon as I saw some cards in Amethyst, I fell in love. So we're going to explore Amethyst for sure as our first deck. I knew it from the start. Why Amethyst? Well, we're going to go into some of the cards that stood out, but suffice to say that card draw is hard to come by in this game so far with the cards that have been revealed, and Amethyst has the majority of them. So I knew I was going to go with Amethyst, but what are we going to partner Amethyst with? Well, my first instinct was to partner with Sapphire. I mentioned that Sapphire has a lot of ramp. What's the problem with drawing a lot of cards? Well, it costs ink to draw cards. So if I don't have a lot of ink, then I can't really play those cards that I drew if I'm spending all my ink drawing cards. So if I could both ramp up my ink and have card drawing, either characters or action cards or items, right? I thought that would complement each other really, really well. The problem that I found, based on what's released, is that neither of these colors has big characters.
Oh, I feel simply awful.
So what's the problem with drawing a bunch of cards and ramping up your ink? Well, if I have nothing but 2 2s and 3 3s, and all of a sudden you're dropping 6 6s and 6 8s and all that, right? All of a sudden, all of my advantage is gone because I might take 3 or 4 of my characters to banish one of yours, right? So you need some, what I often refer to as beef or size, bigger characters with more strength and more willpower. And right now, neither Amethyst nor Sapphire have bigger characters. So I knew I had to partner Amethyst with a different ink color. So where can I go to for bigger characters? Well, there were 2 colors that stood out as having kind of the best bigger characters, which was Ruby and Steel. So how do we choose between Ruby and Steel as our second color? Well, as much as I love Lorcana.com, and it is wonderful, my heart still lies in spreadsheets. So I actually put together spreadsheets for each of the colors to take a closer look at everything. And as I assembled each card that was available, I kept track of some key things. I kept track of cost. I kept track of strength, willpower, and lore. And why I focused on those, obviously the action cards and the items are relevant, but I focused on the characters first because I was looking for efficiencies. I was looking for where am I getting the most bang for my buck, as it were, right? When I'm paying 4 ink, am I getting a 1-1 that produces 1 lore, or am I getting a 4-4 that produces 4 lore? Thankfully, neither of those exist, but where am I getting more efficiencies? So this is where you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. We're going to talk about math. Ooh. Specifically, I wanted to know what was the ratio for each color of ink spent to strength, will, and lore. And I averaged them out between the different colors, ink colors, and I came to these results. So I looked at, for every 1 ink I'm spending, what am I getting on average in terms of strength, willpower, and lore? So for example, we've got amber here. And for every 1 ink that I spend, on average, on any one random card, a character rather, in amber, I'm getting 3/4 strength, 0.72 strength, roughly 1 willpower, and roughly half a lore. Obviously, you're not getting any cards with 0.7 strength and 0.47 lore, but on average per 1 that I spent, right? So what I was looking for was, where was I getting the highest ratios? And what stood out for me was that Steel really had a bit of an advantage over Ruby in one particular category. You can see in strength, they were both relatively the same at roughly 0.75 strength per ink spent for their characters. Willpower, lore, they were about the same, roughly 1/3 lore for every ink spent. Willpower, though, is where they stood out. Effectively, Steel was 1/3 stronger in willpower per lore spent than Ruby was. If you're not particularly comfortable with fractions or math or anything like that, basically just look at which of the numbers of these are bigger, right? The bigger the number, the more efficient your characters are. The more you're getting, the more bang for your buck you're getting. Now, this doesn't take into effect abilities or things like that. So this isn't saying that Steel is inherently better than Ruby, but as far as efficiencies of the characters go, Steel is, roughly speaking, better than Ruby. So based on those numbers, I decided to go with Steel to partner with Amethyst. Ultimately, I'm going to want to test out every combination of cards and colors, but for a starting off point, this gave me a good idea of where I wanted to go. Quite frankly, it also reinforced for me that Amethyst was a great color to choose, because if you look at it, Amethyst outweighs a lot of the other colors as well. In lore, it is the most efficient. You get a full half point of lore for every ink spent on average for Amethyst characters. In willpower, it is also leading the other colors. It has the highest ratio of willpower per ink spent. It is a little bit less in strength than some of the other colors, but it still ranks 3rd in strength behind Ruby and Steel per ink spent. So all in all, it reinforced that Amethyst was the right choice between my love of card advantage and those stats, and Steel I thought was a good secondary option. So knowing that, we went with Steel and Amethyst in our deck builder. So we want to build a deck, but where the heck do we start? We decided that we want Amethyst and Steel. There's a lot of cards at our disposal. So how do we even go about getting started? Well, first of all, our deck has a purpose. We are a mid-range deck that is trying to control the board, control the pace of play, develop card advantage, and ensure that we don't get overwhelmed by potentially a ramp deck with big creatures or a tempo deck with a bunch of early characters. Yes, I will keep interchanging creatures and characters for a little bit while I get used to the language. So, where do we even begin? Well, to accomplish those goals, we've got various aspects that we're trying to address. So let's address one of these at a time and try and determine what cards might we select from those available to complement that particular part of our strategy. So let's start from the beginning of the game. The early game, how do we maintain control? How do we ensure that we don't get overwhelmed? We've got a tempo deck on the other side, bunch of early characters. How do we avoid getting overwhelmed so that they don't race us to 20 lore or just overwhelm our board and be able to challenge what few characters we put out and banish them? Well, one of the prime cards that we have at our disposal to avoid that is Captain Hook, Forceful Duelist. So why is Captain Hook so effective? Well, Picture your opponent putting out a couple of 2/2s, a 3/3, something like that to try and overwhelm your board. Now, if you've got someone like Elsa Snow Queen out that's a 2/3, you can, to some extent, take care of those 2/2s, right? Or if you've got your own 2/2s out, you can take care of that. But the 3/3 becomes challenging. That's an early game play that can come out as quickly as typically turn 3 with a Jasmine or Hercules or someone like that. And it's hard for you to deal with that. But you can very efficiently deal with that with Captain Hook, Forceful Duelist. He can challenge as a 3/2. As we saw in our Game 2 match, him challenging some less strong characters and then remaining on the board is actually not really ideal for him because he only hits back for 1 damage if he's challenged, if he's exerted. But if you can take out a 3/2 or a 2/3 or a 3/3 with Captain Hook, that's a good exchange for you. So that's what you're looking to control with Captain Hook, is some of those slightly bigger creatures that your deck might have a problem with otherwise, especially those with 3 toughness, right? What else is at our disposal? Well, Goons is a great one to just cheaply get out and throw into an opposing Stitch new dog or something to that effect. It's not as exciting as Captain Hook, but it serves the purpose of maintaining control in the early game. Likewise, to get rid of those 2 toughness creatures, we've got Fire the Cannons. Now we're going to explore a little bit later how that can be even more useful for us, but Fire the Cannons helps clear some of those early 2/2s out of the way. Beyond card advantage, something like Fire the Cannons and Captain Hook also gives us what we like to call ink advantage. Well, what's an ink advantage? That's where someone put out, for example, a Jasmine or a Hercules that costs 3 ink, and we dealt with it with either a Captain Hook or something to that effect for the cost of 1 ink. Or where they paid 2 ink for an Yzma, and we dealt with it with a 1 ink Goons. So the more ink advantage we can get, that helps us too, because we're going to be spending some ink trying to develop our card advantage. So if we can eke out some ink advantage along the way, that's going to help us as well. To that same effect, Prince Eric also helps with the ink advantage. Much like Captain Hook, he can take out a 3 toughness creature, which will usually cost 3 or more, for 2. He's not as good as Captain Hook, but the advantage he has over Captain Hook is that 1 extra bit of toughness. So he might be able to take out, for example, a 2/2 and survive to tell the tale, and then maybe target another character a little further down the line. So not as efficient as Captain Hook, but still one that helps us take care of those 3 toughness creatures and might be able to take out 2 characters over the course of a couple of turns and thus develop some extra card advantage. So the last one that we've got to be able to maintain control in the early game is Smash. This is one that I'm a little bit more reserved on. I obviously love the fact that it's inkable, where Fire the Cannons is not. But when it costs 3 times as much as Fire the Cannons and only deals half as much more damage, deals 1 extra damage for 2 more cost, that's a lot to try and accept. That's hard for me. So I'm still reserved on how effective Smash is, but suffice to say, we'd need it to some extent to try and overcome that deficit in the early game. So let's go back to our deck now, start adding those in to deal with that early tempo play. So let's start with Captain Hook. We're going to add in 4 of them because he is fantastic. We're absolutely going to want to add in 4 Fire the Cannons. I'm a little scared about the fact that it's not inkable. And I addressed this in our first gameplay video. But I think it's still good enough that we're going to want 4 of them. I think 4 Goons, likewise, is going to be important. They're not as strong, obviously, as Captain Hook or Prince Eric, but I think that they're efficient enough that we're going to want 4 of them, and they're inkable. So worst case scenario, we can turn them into ink. Prince Eric, again, not as efficient as Captain Hook, but I think we can't just rely on 8 low cost or even 10 between Captain Hook, Goons, and Prince Eric. So I think we're going to want 4 of him just to make sure that we can control that. Smash, I'm going to be a little bit more hesitant on. I'm going to hedge a little bit, and I think I'm just going to include 2 Smash for now. We'll see how the deck plays out, and we'll see if we might want to add more of those. All right, so we've accomplished, to some degree, controlling that early game. Let's go to the flip side of that and talk about late game control. So we need to control a couple of things. We need to control big creatures, big characters. Sorry, right? We might need to control evasive characters. So Simba, Return King, is going to help us in both those regards. He's a big time challenger with that challenge +4 for 8 damage. So he can take out every character that currently exists in the game. And he can deal with evasive characters. So in both those regards, I think Simba is very useful. He is 7 cost. So I think we might want to be a little bit cautious with adding too many of him in as well. But certainly we're at least going to want some. And then Gantu. So Gantu is one that obviously he's big, but he's not massive. He's 6'6", so he's definitely going to have some bulk. But for 8, that's not a huge ratio. By contrast, if we look at Cerberus, he's 5 for a 5'6". He costs 3 less and only 1 less strength. The reason why I want to lean towards Gantu is because he does a little bit of 2 things. He has a bit of the late game control with size, but he also has some degree of tempo control. There could be a point where you establish control in the early game and then slowly begin to lose it over the mid game if you're not able to maintain control. So Gantu can potentially catch you up where they might have a bulk of characters that you don't want attacking in and challenging your characters. So I'm hesitant on Gantu. I'm mixed on him, but I definitely want to give him a try because I think he can definitely fill a couple of spots there. I did debate Cerberus to what I just mentioned, but I left him off for now just because I'm not entirely sure. And the last late game control, which might not seem that way on the surface, is Elsa Snow Queen. She's a 2/3, so obviously she's not controlling the late game through the size herself, but she's going to allow us to break stalemates. She's going to allow us to force an opponent to exert a character they might want to have kept safe, to keep away from being able to be challenged. A card like Stitch Rockstar, or even Moana, that needs to be exerted for her ability, but they might be waiting for the optimal time, and we don't want to give them that opportunity. So Elsa can absolutely break some stalemates there, and then also has that 3rd point of toughness that can help a little bit with that early game as well. So let's go back to the board here. Let's go back to our deck and add in some of those. So Elsa, I think because she is on the cheaper end of these cards that we mentioned, I think we're going to want 4 of her. I could see a world where 2 might be appropriate because she's not one that you necessarily want 3 on the board, but I still think that she helps us a little bit with that 3rd point of willpower, and she's just so useful in the late game. Gantu, because we're just kind of testing him out, let's stick with 2 for Gantu. And then Simba, I could see a world where we would want 4 of him, but I'm going to include 2 for now just because of how expensive he is. And we'll see if we might come across this situation where, yeah, we could really use more bulk. We need more on the high end. All right, going back up to the top here. What else? We've got our early game control. We've got our late game control. Now let's talk about the mid game. And the mid game is all about that card advantage. Obviously, there's opportunities for card advantage throughout the game, but the middle of the game is really where you want to be forcing that issue, right? I'm talking about turns, say 4 through 8, maybe even like 3 through 7, somewhere around there. It'll shift. But in those mid turns, mid rounds, right? Hopefully you've done enough to control the early game. You've got some threats out there. You've got some things that are kind of forcing your opponent to stall a little bit. But before the late game bombs start coming out, the really big characters, that's where you want to establish your card advantage most of all. So what can we do to establish card advantage? Yzma Alchemist made the cut. So, although Yzma is not card advantage per se, she is in a roundabout way. So she has the ability You're Excused. Whenever this character quests, look at the top card of your deck. Put it on either the top or the bottom of your deck. So how is this card advantage? You're not drawing extra cards. Well, the way that it's card advantage in a roundabout way is that you can filter through some of the cards that are effectively useless for you to draw. If we're on turn 8 or 9 and we're dropping cards like Simba Return King or Gantu or, Maleficent, what we refer to as Maleficent Dragon, right? Big characters, right? You don't want to be drawing a Stitch new dog, right? So this is where being able to put some of the cards that are no longer relevant to you on the bottom of your deck, thus increasing your chances of drawing the cards that are more relevant in the late game, that can be really valuable. Likewise, in the early game, it's not so much about that particular form of card advantage, but for example, in the early game, if this is, questing on turn 3, for example, you might not want to draw your 9-cost Maleficent Dragon, right? So the ability to put her on the bottom to hopefully draw cards that you can cast now becomes a lot more relevant. So Yzma, although not necessarily at the level of some of the other cards that we're going to explore in this deck, absolutely made the first cut because I think her ability is strong and she's at least somewhat efficiently costed for 2 ink for a 2/2, 2 strength and 2 will, right? So we got Yzma, 2 cost. What else do we got? Well, we've got some amazing 3-cost cards for card advantage in this deck. The 2 that are most obvious, the ones that have really won my heart over, the ones that I love dearly. First one, Friends on the Other Side. I talked earlier about how card drawing is relatively sparse in this set so far. So just without even taking into consideration the song aspect of it, 3 ink, 3 inkable ink, so you can also ink this card itself, not that you would ever want to, but if you desperately needed to, you could use it as ink. But 3 ink for drawing 2 cards, that alone can be really strong. You've already seen in some of the games how strong it was to draw extra cards, and all of a sudden the person that did just has this flood of resources and the other person stagnates, and then it's game over, right? Then you factor in the song aspect, right? So you can effectively play this for free. So for example, we play Maleficent Sorceress on turn 3, draw a card from her, and then the next turn use her to sing Friends on the Other Side, and now I've got an extra 3 cards with that 2/2 still in play and threatening my opponent's characters. And I've still got 4 ink open because I didn't have to use any ink to cast Friends on the Other Side because I used Maleficent to sing it. Oh my goodness. Huge advantage. So this card, just without question, should go into the deck. Maleficent Sorceress, absolutely competing with that. Absolutely, they're 1 and 2. Why? Well, on surface, it seems pretty boring, quite frankly, right? 3 ink for a 2/2 that draws a card. Great. It doesn't, make a big splash. It's not super exciting, sexy. I mean, unless that's your thing, right? But the fact that you get a body in play while also replacing the card that you spent to get that character in play is actually huge. Again, not by itself. If your opponent's playing out three Stitch new dogs to your 1 Maleficent Sorceress, that's not that relevant, right? But as soon as you can find a way to control that tempo, if you can, the fact that your opponent used 3 cards to just get 2/2 bodies, you can potentially really overwhelm them in terms of resources, right? So this is a card that replaces itself, while also affecting the board. So it's a great combination of card advantage and board presence. Nothing huge, but absolutely you should be including this if you want to build a mid-range type deck. And then Tinkerbell Tiny Tactician. Much like Yzma, she is not distinctly card advantage, but she is in that if you're later on in the game and you draw that flounder that I was talking about with Yzma, you can draw and discard, maybe draw something much better, discard flounder, and then you practically are up a card because flounder isn't affecting things all that much anymore that late in the game. So I knew I wanted Tinkerbell in. And then stat-wise, she's pretty solid as well. 3 ink for a 2/4 with 1 lore. Not lighting the world on fire, but efficient enough that combined with her ability, I was really happy to have her on. Captain Hook, Captain of the Jolly Roger. So, card advantage. Again, how is this card advantage? Well, if you're playing Fire the Cannons, the fact that you can cast him, get a 3/4 body on the board, and get a card back in hand. Now, it's a specific card, but it's still an additional card back in hand that you can then use, is card advantage, right? How is he efficiency-wise? Not great. 4 ink for a 3/4. Compare that to the wardrobe, for example. Not great, but not bad either for the fact that you get some card advantage out of him. The part that makes me scared about Captain Hook is that he's not inkable. I think that the card advantage and the fact that he's relatively efficient absolutely makes him worth a first look. But I'll admit, it's got me worried. I do not want a large ratio, and we're going to look at this later, of non-inkable cards. And finally, we've got Beast's Mirror. So Beast's Mirror is obviously going to be a little bit more of a late game card than a mid game card, but it is still part of our card advantage engine. And you might ask, I'm in Amethyst, why would I not use Magic Mirror? And this really boils down to a question of competing value. Magic Mirror has the value that it can draw a card no matter what. It has 0 restrictions on the ability to draw a card other than paying for the ability. Whereas Beast's Mirror requires you to empty your hand. However, I think Beast's Mirror has 2 key advantages that really overcome that deficit and that challenge. Which is one, and I think first and foremost, it's inkable. So imagine that in the early game, you're trying to overcome some early tempo from the opponent, and you've got 1 or 2 magic mirrors in your hand. And so now you have to make the choice of the stuff that you want to be playing, what you're going to put down as ink, because you can't put down that magic mirror. Whereas Beast Mirror, you could put that down. In the late game, obviously that's going to be less relevant. Right? The late game, you're just looking to draw the cards, so you're happy to draw either one. But in the early game, that ability to not put down Magic Mirror as ink in a time where you really don't need that card draw engine yet can be very significant. The other issue looks like a small one, but I would argue that it's actually quite big, which is the cost of the ability. Magic Mirror costs 4 to activate, and Beast's Mirror costs 3. Only 1 ink difference. But the problem with just even 1 ink difference is you could draw all the cards you want, but if you can't cast them, if you can't play them, then it's all for naught. Then you're inevitably going to lose. And I think the amount that slows you down from being able to both draw a card and play it on the same turn, or you've played everything you've got to play, do I have enough ink left to draw a card? It's going to be so much more frequent that you're going to be able to afford 3 ink versus 4, that I think you're going to find you have a lot of times where you've got Magic Mirror down on the table and you're really not going to want to use it or not going to be able to use it. So I think that's a big difference. And the fact of the matter is, yeah, you've got to empty your hand with Beast Mirror, but in these situations, especially if we keep our costs a little bit lower, we're going to want to be emptying our hand. We're going to want to throw everything out there so that we've got so much card advantage that we can start making a little bit more inefficient plays. We can throw 3 2/2s, at a 6/6 and be okay because we've been generating so much card advantage. So I think that restriction that you have to empty your hand is not so substantial that it overcomes the 2 deficiencies that Magic Mirror has. So we're going to include Beast Mirror. Because it is strictly a card draw engine and does not affect the board in any other way, I'm going to restrict it to 2, I think, but I still think it's worthwhile. The others, I think, are impactful enough and useful enough, especially Friends on the Other Side and Maleficent Sorceress, that I'm going to want for them. So we're at 48 cards. We've got effectively 12 more cards to fill out. What else are we going to include in here? Well, what else might we need to accomplish? We need to generate lore, right? So a lot of these characters, are going to be 1 lore. A couple of them might be 2. We're not really pushing that because we're trying to control the board and then inevitably win, probably a little slowly, by just really pushing our opponent out of resources so that we've got the only characters left on the board. Still, we don't want to fall too far behind on lore, so we should probably look at a couple of those. And then we might want to look at a couple of niche cards to just fill in the gaps and see if we might be able to use them. All right, so let's talk about 4 cards that we're going to add in here. Let's talk about the ones that I think we could use 4 of. First, we've got Pascal, Rapunzel's companion. This one, I think we've got enough characters in the deck that we could be able to reasonably rely on him having evasive throughout the game. Again, assuming that we can control the board enough to maintain at least one other character at the same time. He's only going to chip away at that lore count, but he's going to do it in a way that does not allow for retaliation, does not allow him to be challenged in return, as long as we can maintain that control. So I think he'll be useful. On the flip side of that is Maleficent biding her time. So Maleficent is super efficient when it comes to her cost versus her lore production. She is the only 1-cost character that produces 2 lore, but she's also very fragile. As you saw in some of our early gameplay videos, there's plenty of times where I don't want to send her off questing because an opponent's got a 2/2 out and can just challenge her and still remain on the board. So I think that I wanted to include her just because she was so efficient, but she's one that really requires you to have absolute control on the board and to some extent clear off your opponent's side of the board to free her up to quest without being challenged in return. Next, we've got a couple of niche cards that I wanted to explore. First one is Beast. We got the Beast here. 5 ink for a 4/4, 2 lore, comes into play, banish an item. Okay, so the strength of Beast is very much connected to how strong are items in this game, right? If we got some really strong items, the ability to get rid of it is super powerful. If the items aren't that impressive, then all of a sudden that ability, likewise, is not that great. Now, because we're in the early days, I didn't really know how strong are the items. So this is one where I actually, right off the bat, added this, but only added 2, because I wanted to play around with it. Because on its surface, even just 5 ink for a 4/4 with 2 lore seems pretty solid. But not good enough to not need his ability to be somewhat impactful. So I wanted to test out how impactful the items were before I really committed. But I do think Beast, now in retrospect, can be quite useful because some of the items are quite good. And then we've got White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. So this came up in the first video. How good is White Rabbit's Pocket Watch? Well, I think that's still up for debate. But let me walk you through my thought process at the time, which was it's inkable, first of all. So inherently, worst case scenario, I can put it down as ink. That's not a bad worst case scenario, right? Its ability is cheap, right? 1 ink to activate, it's not asking a lot. As opposed to Magic Mirror with its 4 ink for that ability, right? Drawing a card is better than Rush, but 4 ink to activate an ability is tough. Whereas 1 ink, you're quite often, if you're not being super efficient with your ink, you're quite often left with 1 ink anyway, right? 1 or more ink. So using it is not burdensome. The crux is the ability useful? At the time, I thought, yeah, that could definitely be useful, right? In a game where it advantages the second person to act with a challenger mechanism, if I can surprise someone when they thought their character, could quest with abandon because there was nobody that I had on my board that could challenge it. The ability to bring out a character and rush it could be really useful. I watched the first video that we put out, the first gameplay video, to see, my thoughts on the downside to the rush ability, or what I would want more out of it. But at the time I was like, yeah, I think that this could definitely be useful. Still not one that I was ready to make a first pick, but I think definitely useful. All right, so let's head back to the deck and fill it out here. I think we've established that we've got 2 Beast. We've got 4 Maleficent biding her time. We've got 4 Pascal. And we've got 2 White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. Which leaves us with 60 cards, 26 from Amethyst, 34 from Steel. We've got 46 characters in the deck, so quite heavy on characters, but I think given the nature of what's been revealed so far, that's inevitable. We've got 6 action cards, 4 action cards that are also songs, so 10 total, 4 items. What does our cost curve look like? Pretty good. Pretty low to the ground. Again, we might end up in a situation where we might want a couple more Simba or Cerberus to maybe give us a little bit more end game control, late game control. But I'm happy with where it looks right now, and we can obviously explore that a little bit more later. The ratio of inkable to non-inkable is always going to concern me. But I think as long as you're under 25%, you're probably safe. So if you think about it, if I'm under 25%, under a quarter of my deck is non-inkable, that means if I'm drawing 7 cards, that means less than 2 of those cards, so average 1 of those cards will be non-inkable, which is totally doable. Even 2 non-inkable cards in your opening hand, probably still fine. Anything more than that, and I would be concerned. So you really want to probably ride below that 25%, but I'm sure part of the metagame being established is really determining what's the ideal there. What can we get away with? And I bet people are going to push the line a little bit with what they can get away with non-inkable cards, but we'll see how that breaks down. Thank you so much for watching. We're obviously wee innocent babbies in the world of YouTube, but we're loving Lorcana, and we would so appreciate you sharing this around so more people can learn about the game and have some fun laughing at 2 goofs in the process. If you'd like to see more, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We've got more videos coming. More than anything, we'd love any feedback on how we can improve these videos for you and others. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time.